It is a great honor to welcome George Chryssides to this program. He is currently the Honorary Research Fellow in Contemporary Religion at York St. John University and the University of Birmingham. And he's an author of a new introduction to the Jehovah's Witnesses, titled Jehovah's Witnesses, A New Introduction. George, thank you for joining the show. How are you today?
Well, I'm well, and thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be on your show.
The honor is all mine. So, first, what makes you interested in new religious movements in general and the Jehovah's Witnesses in particular?
Well, I think what interests me about new religious movements is that people tend to think that they're not well thought out. They're often described as bizarre and wacky and so on. And what is interesting is once you kind of get to know them and to understand them, what they say makes sense, even if it's not compelling. There is an internal logic in what most of them teach. And that's certainly true of Jehovah's Witnesses, which is the movement I've come to know the best, I think, of all the new religions.
Mm-hmm. And the Jehovah's Witnesses in particular, how did you become interested in studying them?
Well, when I was appointed at the University of Wolverhampton, they asked me what new courses I would like to develop. And I said, what about new religious movements, including minority religions? Because Jehovah's Witnesses are not all that new. They've been around for nearly 150 years, but they're not well known. And of course, they're very much in evidence. So what I decided to do was to develop the course, but there were few books in the library. So my plan was to write round various groups and to say to them, maybe you could supply us with your own literature for the students, and then they would be getting first-hand knowledge about what you teach and practice, rather than relying on the media or on Christian evangelical publications, which are often quite hostile. So we got quite a lot of books, but the Jehovah's Witnesses phoned me up to say that it wasn't usual for them just to send out books in demand. They would prefer to have someone visit me. Mm-hmm. So I said, that's fine. And that was, let me see, that was 30 years ago, almost exactly. And the city overseer and I laugh at it now because he told me he was very nervous. He didn't usually go up to universities and knock on lecturers' doors. And I was thinking, why can't they just give me the books? So anyway, we established a very good rapport. And what I've always liked to do in teaching religion is to ensure that students learn about religion as it is, not as it is in the textbooks, because often there's a big difference between what people read and what the believers actually practice. So we got Bill, the city overseer, along to talk to students, and that worked really well. He was a very good presenter, and we got on well. And to be truthful, I didn't know a huge amount about Jehovah's Witnesses at the time, and he helped me to fill in a number of gaps. And I got to know the people at the local Kingdom Hall and attended some of the meetings, and it kind of built up from there. So that was how it started. It's also worth saying that I was brought up in quite a religious family. My mother believed her Bible and always insisted on reading it to us when we were children. So I've always been more interested in new religions that are based on the Bible, because I can understand, I think, how they interpret it and how they interpret it in different ways from the way I was trained to do when I was church student many years ago.
Okay. I should say that my own interest in new religious movements comes from being in Vienna, where the place I currently live in is close to a church which belongs to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints,
Oh, yes.
or the Mormons, and I've
Right.
had plenty of interactions with the missionaries there who are from America and come to understand them quite a bit. And also in Vienna, I do find that there are stands of people who are Jehovah's Witnesses, and they look to talk to anyone who would approach them. So I wonder if at first, how do Jehovah's Witnesses see themselves as Christians?
But I think interesting you mentioned the Mormons, because I know a number of well-educated people that think that they're one and the same, and of course they're not. One big difference between Jehovah's Witnesses and the Latter-day Saints is that the Latter-day Saints have a new revelation. They have a prophet in Joseph Smith, whereas Jehovah's Witnesses, on the other hand, they have their leadership, but the leaders don't claim to have any special revelation. There is nothing new about what Jehovah's Witnesses teach. They would say they simply teach what is in the Bible, which they believe to be inerrant. There are no mistakes in the Bible. They will claim it's true historically, scientifically, it provides accurate guidance for life, and so on. So that's the main difference. And of course, we all see them in the stands in the streets. It's interesting you say that people approach them, because that's their policy. They don't normally come out and grab you and say, are you interested in the Kingdom Hall meetings? They will wait until they get people going up to them and asking them things, and then they will explain what they believe and practice. And their main aim would be to interest you to take a step further, which would be to attend a Bible study. So the next stage would be that someone would come to your home, and then they would use one of their courses and go through certain themes based on the Bible with you. And then they would also encourage you to come to the Kingdom Hall and attend their meetings. And the final step would be getting baptized, because you can't just decide I'm a Jehovah's Witness. It's not like some Christian evangelicals that would say, like Billy Graham used to do, if we remember him, he would ask you to come forward at a meeting, and he went for on-the-spot conversions. Well, you can't do that with Jehovah's Witnesses. They want to make sure you understand the faith. They also want to make sure that your lifestyle is appropriate too.
Yes, and I'm a member of the Catholic Church, and in Vienna, Austria, there are plenty of them. There's actually one that's very close to my house, and I remember my conversion process, which took a good number of, more than half a year in order to do so, to study the catechism and to understand it, and to understand the sacraments and the rites needed to be an official member. Nevertheless, tell me about their methods, the Jehovah's Witnesses methods of I guess evangelizing, because what I find in common with the Mormons and the Witnesses is that they actively go out there in pursuit of I guess new converts, whereas both the Catholic Church and mainstream Protestant churches do not. If you want to find out more about them, you have to go to one of their churches. Whereas in the case of the Mormons and the Witnesses, their church comes to you.
That's it. Yes, absolutely. Well, maybe at this point I can do a share screen.
Okay.
Just brighten up the presentation, hopefully, so that you don't have to look at me all the time. But by the way, I've altogether done 4 books. Well, depending on how you count them, it's kind of 3.5, I guess. The first one I did was a reference work, a historical dictionary of Jehovah's Witnesses. It was upgraded to also the historical dictionary of Jehovah's Witnesses, but it was a revised and expanded edition. Then the most substantial one is that Jehovah's Witnesses Continuity and Change. And then the one you mentioned, the new introduction, came out in the late part of 2022. But the picture I wanted to show was the second one here. That's their two methods of evangelizing. The more traditional one is the people that come to your door. And I think most of us have had a knock at the door or a ring of the doorbell. And then what they say is that they're fulfilling the biblical practice of going from door to door. Because the book of Acts, which talks about the set up in the early church, says that the disciples went preaching from house to house. So they make a point of going from house to house. And then fairly recently, I think it was 2012, they started having these stands. They actually went into towns a bit earlier than that, but they also say that that's in accordance with early church practice. That Paul went into the marketplace to do preaching. He didn't simply go around people's houses. So that's why you see the stands. And one key thing about Jehovah's Witnesses is that they want to get back to the early church practice of not just evangelizing, but of worshipping, because they say that at a very early stage, the Christian church, or Christendom as they prefer to call it, they say they abandoned the earliest practices, and they did things like introducing new doctrines like the Trinity. They started having a separate clergy class that wore pretentious robes and had a very elaborate liturgy and burnt incense and did all sorts of things, which I'm sure you're familiar with as a Roman Catholic. And they say, well, the early Christians didn't do that. Paul didn't wear posh robes or burn incense. It was a straightforward message about believing in Jesus and believing that the Bible was true, because they teach that the Bible was written by this early community of Christians.
Mm-hmm. So to that extent, both the Mormons and the Witnesses see themselves as kind of new Protestants, so to speak, right? Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting question, because somebody asked me recently, are Jehovah's Witnesses Protestant? And I thought, well, I'll look up to see what they themselves say about it. And there is an article in the Watchtower that actually says we are not Protestants. Now, it's one of these questions where there's no kind of right answer. They're in the Protestant tradition, because they have come, the route they've come is through Protestantism, through the Protestant Reformation, through the Adventist tradition. And then Charles Taze Russell, their founder leader, wasn't happy with Adventism either. So he established his own group of students that studied the Bible. So they don't deny being Protestant, because they don't go along with all that the Protestant churches teach, like the doctrine of the Trinity, the deity of Jesus Christ, and the personhood of the Holy Spirit. These are things that they don't agree with, and say that these were later additions to the Christian teaching. So at the same time, they say, well, people like Martin Luther were on the right lines. They were actually questioning a number of practices in Roman Catholicism that we've appropriated. So they think Martin Luther wasn't such a bad guy. He was doing the right thing, but he didn't go far enough. And then they say that groups like the Hutterites, they did a bit better. They actually had their own community separating from the world, but their problem was that they didn't go out and preach. They kept themselves to themselves. So the Witnesses also want to adopt these practices, these doctrines of the early church and forms of worshipping, but they think it's important to fulfill what they call Christ's Great Commission, the words he said to his disciples at the end of Matthew's Gospel, which I put up on the screen a moment ago, go and preach the gospel to all nations and baptize. So that's what they seek to do.
Mm-hmm. I think that their view of God and their rejection of the Trinity doctrine may have influenced the fact that they do not celebrate the conventional Christian holidays like Christmas or presumably Easter. So, well, I have a twofold question there. Why don't they celebrate these holidays? And secondly, what holidays, festivals do they celebrate or observe?
Right, it's an interesting question because it didn't all come at once. I think it's not so well known that Jehovah's Witnesses never celebrated Easter. Partly because they say it's a pagan festival. It's to do with the pagan god Oistra. And but also what is less known is that the Adventist groups that Charles Taze Russell, their founder, belonged to, didn't celebrate Easter because they alighted on the Jewish date. They said, well, the Last Supper was an event that was celebrated on the Hebrew month of Nisan, the 14th day. Now, when you look up your calendar, you'll find that Nisan 14 doesn't fall on a Thursday, as you would expect as you'd expect the mainstream Christians to observe, because Monday, Thursday, the date of the Last Supper, is always a Thursday. And then Jesus was crucified the day after, which was a Friday. Now, if you try to reconcile that with the Jewish calendar, it doesn't work. More often than not, Nisan 14 falls on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. So that means that if you take 3 days on from that, you don't get a Sunday. So those Adventists that Russell was acquainted with couldn't actually celebrate Easter on a Sunday. If you look at one or two very old Watchtower publications, you'll find that Russell says to them, we are celebrating Christ's resurrection on, and then he names a date. And if you look up the calendar, you'll find it was a Wednesday. So there was nothing to connect the celebration of Easter specifically with Sundays. So that's an additional reason why the Jehovah's Witnesses don't want to celebrate Easter. The celebration of Christmas, that was something that came a bit later under the second leader, Joseph Franklin Rutherford. Actually, maybe a good idea at this point to share the screen again, if I can do it. Sorry, it's not, that should be it. Yeah, there have been a number of leaders. Charles Taze Russell was the one I mentioned, that's his picture. He started off a small group of Bible students because he couldn't agree with the teachings of all the churches he had come across in his region. And then what happened with Russell was that he organized the publication of the Watchtower magazine. The original name for the society was Zion's Watchtower Tract Society. So it produced Bibles and tracts. And the group of Bible students that Russell got together, they became part of a kind of federation. So other congregations could use Russell's literature. They would study it on a Sunday or during the week and discuss it. And it was up to them what they did in their worship. But they would come together to celebrate what they called the memorial, which is the celebration of Jesus' last evening meal with his disciples. So from a loose federation, after Russell died, Joseph Franklin Rutherford took over, and he wanted to get things a bit more organized than that. So what he said was that it wasn't enough just to be a kind of federation. We had to be a single organization. So he organized it from the top with a very firm structure and introduced a number of practices. He was very much anti-war. Russell didn't approve of it, but didn't forbid it. But when Rutherford came to power, he said, we're not doing it, you don't take part in a war, he made house-to-house visiting an obligation for members. If you wanted to be an elder in the organization, you had to do house-to-house work. And he was the one that effectively abolished Christmas, because he said that was a pagan festival. Russell hadn't any particular objections to Christmas. It was celebrated up to 1927, and then Rutherford took over, and that became standard practice. And I think that was what you were asking about the festivals. Maybe I could go on just to say that birthdays, they don't celebrate birthdays because they think that it's kind of self-centered, it's materialistic. And they also say that there are two birthdays that are mentioned in the Bible. There was the Pharaoh's birthday that resulted in the butler being hanged. There was Herod's birthday where his daughter requested the head of John the Baptist, and John the Baptist died. So the idea was that birthdays weren't particularly good things, although the Bible doesn't explicitly forbid them. So when birthdays ceased to be celebrated is not quite clear. It was sometime in the 1940s, possibly after Rutherford's leadership. He died in 41, and then Nathan Noor took over, and we can say a bit more about him later. But that's how they regard festivals. They're not biblical, they're pagan in origin, and they don't seem to have a terribly good press in the Bible when it comes to birthday celebrations.
So another aspect of their belief system that is controversial to, I think, not just Christians, but even non-Christians alike, that is their refusal to enter national service, particularly military service, and also their refusal to salute the flag of whatever country they happen to be in. I remember there was a Supreme Court case involving the obligation to stand up and recite the Pledge of Allegiance back in the 30s and 40s when it was first instituted, and the plaintiffs in that case were Jehovah's Witnesses. So how do you explain this aspect of their beliefs?
They say that honor should only be given to Jehovah, and just as the early Christians refused to pay homage to the Roman emperor, then they're fulfilling that particular aspect of early church practice. It is important only to give honor to God, or as they prefer to call him, Jehovah. So acknowledging the state, saluting the flag, is actually being disloyal to God. And as for war, they will say that the biblical teaching is that in the ideal world, people will beat their swords to plowshares, as the prophet Isaiah says. They won't study war anymore. And Jesus is described as the Prince of Peace. So, I mean, one can argue about whether the Bible is wholly consistent about that, but that is the line that they will take.
But of course, a rebuttal would be in the time of the prophet Isaiah, and also in the time of Christ, holy men and women go to war too, and even afterwards with the crusade. So and also there's nothing in the Bible that explicitly says that you should not go to war. In fact, in Catholicism, there's a thing called the just war doctrine.
Just war, that's right, yes. Well, what they say about the Old Testament, or they prefer to call it the Hebrew Aramaic scriptures, they say, well, that is the Old Covenant. So there are things in the Old Testament, as you and I call it, that are no longer applicable. So one example would be Sunday observance, that the Bible says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, but that's only in the Old Testament. The New Testament doesn't say anything about Sunday observance. On the contrary, there's the story about Jesus walking through the cornfields on the Sabbath and saying, well, it's all right doing that. So their attitude to the Old Testament is that it's only valid if there is something in the New Testament that reinforces it. So the question would be, what about all these wars in the Old Testament? Does the New Testament say it's okay to go to war? And they will claim it doesn't. As for the Crusades, well, they belong to an apostate church, as Jehovah's Witnesses would put it. That is part of the way in which the mainstream Christian faith fell away from the original teachings, because the early disciples didn't go to war. It was really only when Christianity was appropriated by the Roman Emperor that it took part in the wars on behalf of the Roman Emperor. So that's how they would explain it. So they're not exactly pacifist. They say that when it comes to war, they're normally conscientious objectors. They will say that if Jehovah were to say to them, go to war, then they would do it. And of course, there is the coming Battle of Armageddon, which the 144,000, together with the angels and the Archangel Michael, will be taking part in. So in that regard, Jehovah's Witnesses are not totally anti-war as such, but they won't take part in wars that are simply for economic or political gain.
Well, I think the Jehovah's Witnesses, like many new religious movements, have been designated a cult by many who are outside the church, obviously, and also by ex-JW who have had bad experience in growing up in the church and being part of the church. I think one of the things that bolster their case is their practice of disfellowshipping. The idea of, like, if you fall away from the tenets of the church, you are not allowed to communicate with any members of the church, that including your own family. So tell us about that.
Yes, well, the Jehovah's Witnesses have a relatively strict system of maintaining discipline. So if you and I were to do something inappropriate in our denominations, we might be told off for it. I think in an extreme case, we could be denied the sacrament, but that rarely happens. With Jehovah's Witnesses, it's different because they go along with the biblical convention of having two witnesses. So if there are two witnesses to an offense and it's a serious offense, then you will be brought before the elders. You will be told that you're expected to attend a judicial hearing, and the judicial committee will listen to the evidence, and then they will decide what is appropriate. It may be that they won't necessarily disfellowship you. They might give you what's called a judicial reproof. So that basically means we're going to keep an eye on you, and we're going to watch your behavior, make sure that this doesn't recur. They might alternatively decide that the offense was serious enough for you to be put outside the congregation. So what that means is that you don't communicate with other members of the congregation, and they're instructed not to speak to you. The reason being that they want to keep the congregation pure. They also want to give you a bit of a shock too, because if you're sent to Coventry, I guess it's not particularly pleasant experience. So you ought to be thinking, I ought to make an effort to get back in. So you're not barred from attending congregational meetings. You can actually attend a meeting in the Kingdom Hall. It used to be that you had to sit at the back They now tell me that that's no longer the case. You can actually sit in the middle of the congregation, but you still mustn't speak or be spoken to. And if you were to raise your hand, because sometimes the conductor of the meeting will ask questions to the congregation, if you were to raise your hand to try and answer a question, you would be ignored, because you are treated as if basically you just weren't there. But the elders will come from time to time to ask how you are getting on. Have you thought the better of what you did? What are you going to do to kind of make amends? And once they think you have genuinely repented, then you can be taken back into the congregation and reinstated.
No, I guess my response to that would be, I mean, doesn't Christ preach, forgiveness, and whoever is without sin cast the first stone, and obviously mercy. And to me, it sounds a lot like they are practicing a culture of shaming.
Well, so I certainly wouldn't want to defend Jehovah's Witnesses, and I hope that people that listen to this podcast won't misconstrue what I'm saying. I'm explaining what they're doing, and as I used jokingly to say to my students, don't blame me, I don't invent the religions, I only teach them. So, I certainly wouldn't say disfellowshipping is what we all ought to be doing, but yeah, they would say, well, there is mercy and that you have the opportunities to repent. What they don't want is somebody in the congregation that perhaps has been committing adultery, which I think is probably the most serious or the most common offence that the elders have to deal with. Because that might taint the congregation. The person might be a danger to other men or women. They also don't like open dissent. So they have got a very clear set of teachings. I guess you might be thinking, well, I don't agree with that. But what they can't control what you think. But if you were to go around saying, well, I don't agree with this teaching that the governing body has come out with, if you go spreading that around, then you're a taint to the congregation. You might be what they call causing other people to stumble. In other words, what the Bible says, you shouldn't cause your brother or sister to stumble. So you shouldn't be putting obstacles in their way. So if you're the wrong type of person remaining in the congregation, that could be what you're doing. And if I were to go around spreading false teachings in a kingdom hall, as they would see it, then I might be persuading other people, and then you would get dissent. And I think it was Paul that said that there should be unity within the congregation, and that's what they want to ensure.
So going on to another aspect that's well known, outside of the Jehovah's Witnesses church, and that is their refusal to participate in certain medical practices and procedures, and that includes blood transfusions, even if they know that it can be life-saving. So what is their, I guess, theological basis for that?
The logical basis for that is that when in the story of Noah and the flood, God gave a number of laws to Noah when they all came back out of the ark. And one of the things he said was that you must abstain from, I think it was things strangled and from blood. And it is a dietary law, because Jehovah's Witnesses also won't eat things like blood sausage. If something is basically made from blood, they won't eat it. But the Bible says abstain from blood. And also, importantly, that command they see is reinforced in the New Testament. Because when there were various disputes about the Jewish law in the early church, the disciples met together at the first council in Jerusalem, and they made a number of decisions about what it was or wasn't appropriate to do if you were converting to Christianity. And the decision was that you didn't need to be circumcised like the Jews were, but you should abstain from things strangled and from blood. And that's in Acts 15, I think, if I've got the chapter right. So it's a command that is also reinforced by the new. And then the command is a little bit unclear. It says abstain from blood. So what does abstain mean? So what they say is that means you shouldn't ingest it in the form of blood transfusion. If it's something like a dialysis machine, that is different as they see it, because you're not ingesting somebody else's blood. It's your own blood that is being purified and recycled. When you say they don't agree with certain forms of medical treatment, actually there are quite a lot of forms of medical treatment that they're very amenable to. The Jehovah's Witnesses that I know will do things like visit chiropractors, practice homeopathy. They're quite amenable to all sorts of forms of alternative medicine, but there is one that they won't go along with. Anything that involves hypnosis, they won't do, because they say, well, that's occult. This is Satan trying to get in through your subconscious. So it's not generally well known that they don't go along with that. But if medical treatment involved hypnotizing the patient, then they wouldn't do it.
Right. I think we've spent a good amount of time sort of like dispelling and explaining certain aspects of the JW belief system that may be controversial to outsiders, but we haven't really gotten to like what they believe that is, that is acceptable to them, like central tenets and such. And I would like to begin that particular discussion by asking, well, why is God referred to as Jehovah in according to their beliefs?
Well, the explanation they give is that is his personal name. Now, the way I explain it is that if you call somebody something other than their personal name, you're distancing yourself. Right, I once had a student that persistently called me sir instead of George or Dr. Chryssides, and sir is not my personal name. And I don't know about you, but if somebody does that, it's kind of creating a barrier. And they don't want that kind of barrier to exist between the worshipper and Jehovah. Jehovah is a personal God. Jehovah is your friend. You can talk to Jehovah. And that's one of the reasons why, if you go to a Kingdom Hall meeting, they never use set prayers. Right? It's not a prepared speech to God. It's not like the Roman Catholic liturgy or the liturgy that is in the Church of England that I attend, because that's not how you would address a personal friend. You wouldn't go up to your personal friend and then read off a script. You would talk naturally, and that's how they do it. If you're having a meal with a Jehovah's Witness, then they will thank Jehovah, they will say grace, and the grace is not for what we are about to receive, etc. It's always we thank you, Jehovah, that we have been able to come together. And it's just the same way as I would talk to a friend. So it's therefore important for them to talk to Jehovah by his personal name. And they say that if you address Jehovah as God or the Lord, then that's distancing yourself. If you hold that God is a Trinity, then what do you mean by that? How many people can explain the Trinity? It's a difficult doctrine. And in fact, even clergy at the church I attend they don't like it when they're asked to preach on Trinity Sunday. They'll say, well, this is difficult. So Jehovah's Witnesses will say that God isn't like that. God isn't some kind of mystery that you can't penetrate. He's somebody you can have a direct relationship with. So that's how they see it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I would counter that by saying that according to, the book of Exodus, obviously Jehovah is the anglicized or anglophile pronunciation of of Yahweh, and
Ah,
Yahweh
yes.
is the Hebrew pronunciation of the Tetragrammaton, or HWH in the Latin alphabet. But that is not really what God says His name is. It means I am who am, and it's a statement.
Yeah. Yes, well, as I'm sure you know, in Hebrew, to well, to put it in a kind of simplified way, you've generally got the consonants. It was only later that you had these dots and dashes in the Hebrew language that were the vowels. So YHWH or JHWH, what are the vowels? So traditionally, mainstream Christianity is taught, and the Jews would also teach that it's Yahweh, and the Jews would say that that is a sacred name, you mustn't even pronounce it. So they would always find some way around, substitute the word Adonai, the name, if they're reading from Hebrew scripture. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses say, well, how do we know that these are the right vowels to put in? Because JHWH, it could equally well be Jehovah if you substitute different vowels. Now, how do we know how it was pronounced? Well, it wasn't pronounced. The only time it is believed to have been pronounced was on the Jewish New Year on the Day of Atonement, when the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, and then he could pronounce the divine name. And of course, nobody else was allowed into the Holy of Holies. Who knows what he said? So they will say it was Jehovah. It must have been, because that's the true pronunciation. And you couldn't have gone up to the high priest afterwards and say, excuse me, did you say Yahweh in there? I mean, that would have been unspeakable to ask him a question like that. So there's no way of verifying exactly what the divine name is, but they will say it's Jehovah. They will also say, well, actually, if you look at other names in the Bible, there are names that begin that way, like Jehoshaphat and Jehoram, and they'll see that as confirmatory evidence that they've got it right.
So you mentioned earlier about their millenarian belief that there are only 114,000 souls who shall be saved.
144.
Oh, 144.
144. Yeah, that's
Okay.
right.
But nevertheless, that seems quite that may seem quite dismaying to the number of actual followers of the Jehovah's Witness Church in the world right now, which counts in the millions.
Yes.
So, I guess one should explain. I should ask you to explain why the number 144,000, and whether or not what will come up, say, not just the other members of the Jehovah's Witness Church who may not be in that number, but also the rest of us.
Well, most of them now aren't in that number. It's possible, although we can't verify it, that the idea of this great crowd who are not members of 144,000, that possibly came into existence when the numbers of Jehovah's Witnesses were exceeding that. But originally it was believed by Charles Taze Russell that he originally thought it was 1874 or maybe 1878. There was some leverage in the exact date, and then 1914 is a date that is still important to Jehovah's Witnesses. It was originally believed that Christ would return and he would take his followers up to heaven. Well, of course, that didn't happen. And then, as you say, the numbers of Jehovah's Witnesses far exceeded that. The declared number of Jehovah's Witnesses is nearly 9 million. I think it's more than that, actually, because that number only counts the number of people that are active publishers, as they call them, people are doing the door-to-door and street evangelism. So it's probably nearer, I would guess, about 20,000. But it's a lot. It's certainly more than 144,000. So what's the explanation? The explanation was that in Rutherford's period of office, there were people that used to come to meetings. They were obviously interested in the teachings. When it came to the memorial service, they didn't eat and drink the emblems or elements, as mainstream Christians call them. They didn't consume the bread and wine. So what was their status? So in 1935, Rutherford addressed a convention, and he said to the audience, how many of you belong to the 144,000? And then he said, well, the book of Revelation talks about a great crowd that no person can number. How many of you belong to this great crowd? And half the audience stood up at that point, and he said, you are the great crowd. So the belief is that there are 144,000 people exactly, it's an exact number, that Jehovah has chosen to reign with Christ in heaven. So that's only a small minority now. And basically, in the main, it's people that became Jehovah's Witnesses before 1935. There are some new members of the 144,000, but on the whole, the majority of Jehovah's Witnesses belong to the great crowd. And they won't reign with Jesus in paradise heaven. They will be ruled over in paradise earth. There will be this everlasting paradise after Armageddon, when the earth will gradually be restored to its former state, and it will be like the Garden of Eden, when before Adam and Eve fell from grace. So that's what they can expect. And I've actually tried asking people who are not hard to find that belong to the great crowd. I've said, well, don't you wish you were one of the 144,000? And they've said, no, not particularly. I'm quite happy to experience this paradise because it sounds really great. I mean, just imagine a world where there aren't any wars, where everyone's got enough to eat, everyone has got satisfying work and so on. That sounds pretty good to me. Not sure I would want to belong to the 144,000. You'd have to fight in Armageddon for a start, and I don't think I'd want that.
Well, I think the reason why Jehovah's Witnesses, and I think the same way as Mormons do too, they get a lot of criticisms from, I guess, mainline Christian denominations that they are heretical sects. One is because both of them, I think, do not believe that Christ is God, or they don't believe in the divinity of Christ. I think the doctrine of the Trinity, although it can be very hard to explain to even Christians, let alone non-Christians, is our way, the mainstream Christianity's way of saying that Christ is God. And so, to what extent do the Jehovah's Witnesses believe in Christ's divinity?
Well, they're happy to talk about the divinity, but not the deity. So they make a distinction. So, I mean, Jesus Christ, they will teach, was God-like. He's the Son of God. He's the first of creation. They also teach, and they get quite a bit of criticism for this too, that he is one and the same as the Archangel Michael. And that offends a lot of Christians. Actually, I've been doing a bit of work researching this, and what the critics seem to ignore is that a lot of the Protestant reformers also taught that. Martin Luther entertained that as a speculation, so did John Calvin, and quite a list of others, but it's not generally accepted now. So Jesus, to the mainstream Christian, is not an archangel. He's someone who is God who became man. And that's what offends a good number of mainstream Christians about Jehovah's Witnesses that they're actually lowering the status of Jesus Christ. They're saying he was a created angel, whereas the Nicene Creed says he was eternally begotten of the Father, before all worlds, God from God, light from light, and so on. So they will deny that. They will say, well, the Nicene Creed doesn't belong to early Christianity. St. Paul didn't teach it, etc., etc. That is part of Christian apostasy. So you've got this clash between the mainstream Christians that say you can't downgrade Jesus like that, whereas the Jehovah's Witnesses will say, well, that's not what the Bible says. It's the Bible that is the touchstone, and the Bible doesn't say that God is a Trinity. And there were debates in the early church about the exact status of Jesus, whether he was of the same substance of the Father or whether he was of like substance with the Father. So they say that Jesus was a created being. He was the first of all creation. Because it was the angels, they believed, that were created first when the world was brought into being. So that's one of the big divides.
Mhm. Right. So following up on the heresy point, of course, as you would know, the history of Christianity, especially early Christianity, contains a lot of separate beliefs that would later be denounced as heresies in the eye of that the one church at that time. Now we call it the Catholic Church. It was obviously it was Saint Augustine and Saint Irenaeus who did their best to denounce these sort of like splintered beliefs. You got your Manichaeanism and Pelagianism and the like. How would the Jehovah's Witnesses defend themselves against that charge that they're just another Gnosticism?
Well, they're not Gnostics, because Gnosticism implies that there are kind of grades of spiritual adeptness that you kind of ascend. So they don't teach that. They're perfectly ordinary people living ordinary lives. They're not mystics. They would certainly say that, well, in one sense, they have separated themselves off from mainstream Christianity, but they would say, well, it's a bit misleading to talk about ourselves as a splinter group, because we're not a splinter, we have the truth. And they quite frequently talk about the truth. In fact, right from their early beginnings, Charles Taze Russell talked about the truth. So they've got the truth. It's everyone else that has splintered off as they see it. And as we've been saying in this discussion, they're the ones that have restored original Christianity, or so they believe. So they're restorationists. They're saying, well, let's get back to these original teachings. It's the rest of Christendom that has splintered off.
I believe is what the people of the Church of Latter-day Saints proclaim also. They both have to contend with the fact that they have this new set of revelations that they compiled in the Book of Mormon, as well as the fact that they believe that all the churches at the time of, say, the prophet Joseph Smith, as well as churches today, have strayed away from Christianity, and that they are the restored Church of Christ. So,
well, yes, Jehovah's Witnesses are not the only restorationist group. The big difference, as we said, is that the Jehovah's Witnesses would say, well, it's the Bible that is the touchstone. We don't accept extra biblical revelation. I guess they could ask, have you ever had a revelation that is outside the Bible? I can't speak for other people, but by seeing visions of God and Jesus appearing in a sacred grove, or having a visit from an archangel, these things never happened to me. So I guess if I had to choose between the two, I would go for the more kind of mundane, down-to-earth version of spirituality.
Mhm. I think even the Catholic Church itself is not immune to like new revelations, right? You have stories of the Lady of
Bernadette, yeah,
Fatima and amongst.
yeah, yeah. That's right. Well, um, Jehovah's Witnesses would deny that. They would just say that these were hallucinations. Some of these stories may be invented. Uh, But yeah, they certainly don't accept that these new experiences happen to any of their number.
Mhm. And I think another one too, which is another point of contention, is the Shroud of Turin. And I think to this day, the Catholic Church as a whole has neither confirmed nor denied the
That's right.
authenticity of
Yeah.
the Shroud of Turin. There's still a place of worship where Turin is, and people can still visit and treat it as a sacred object.
Yes, well, I've been there. It's only a facsimile that you get seeing if you go, but yeah, they don't like relics. I mean, these are things that came in at a later stage. In fact, there is a verse in the book of Jude. I don't know if you know it, where the writer refers to the archangel Michael and Satan disputing over the body of Moses.
Hmm.
Do you remember that bit? It's not a well-known text, and I think nobody's quite sure what it means. But evidently in intertestamental literature, there was this dispute about what should happen to Moses' body. And the way Jehovah's Witnesses explain this text is to say, well, Satan wanted the body of Moses so that we could have relics. And you don't want that. Relics belong to an apostate church. Why do we need relics? Why do you need a Shroud of Turin? And people have been worshipping Jehovah quite well enough without these kind of reminders, which may or may not be genuine. So that would be very much the angle that they would take on it. In fact, even mainstream Christians are not convinced that the Shroud of Turin is genuine.
Mhm. So, two final questions. Why has so little research been done on the Jehovah's Witnesses until recently?
Right. No, there hasn't been much research. I think there are a number of reasons for that. The first serious book on Jehovah's Witnesses was written in 1945 by H. Stroup, and it was simply called The Jehovah's Witnesses. And Stroup approached the Watchtower Society and said, I'm interested in writing this book. It's, not the usual cult bashing book. It's a serious work. And would you be prepared to assist me with it? And Nathan Noor, who was then the president, wrote back and said flatly, no. Because, well, two reasons. One was maybe they didn't trust Stroud, but also they've got other things to do in preparing for Armageddon, as they would see it. They wanted to extend their preaching work, so helping academics would be a distraction. Now, they've changed quite a bit over the years, and I found them very helpful to me. Once you build up a rapport, get to know them, and they start to trust you to give a fair presentation, then they will cooperate. Obviously, they've got other things to do, so they can't always give you their undivided attention, and that's fair enough. But the society has changed. They're more amenable. They even turn up, some of them, at academic conferences now, so there are better relationships. I think the other reason why Jehovah's Witnesses didn't get substantially researched over the years was because it's to do with the study of new religions. Certainly when I was a student, which was back in the 1960s, they were considered not worth studying. You studied the Christian faith, and you didn't In fact, even Roman Catholicism wasn't particularly studied when I was a student, because the Protestant seminary I went to kind of knew that they were wrong. And Orthodoxy, I don't think was even mentioned. So new religious groups were kind of beyond the pale. You just didn't study them. So it was in the 1970s that other groups began to hit public attention, like the Moonies, the Scientologists, the Hare Krishnas, and that aroused a lot of interest. So it was the sociologists that got in first. I think that's a pity, actually, that, I've a lot of good friends that are sociologists, but I think it's a shame that we're still dominated with sociological study of these organizations. But anyway, as a result of the interest, mainly by sociologists, in the new religions, the older ones got passed over. They weren't so exciting. Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Christadelphians, Christian Scientists, they simply got ignored. Mormons were a bit different because they've got their own tradition of scholarship. They've got their own universities. So that wasn't quite so bad as far as academic study was concerned. The Jehovah's Witnesses have never had their own seminaries. They've got their own training courses for their elders and for people that go around publishing, but nothing as substantial as the kind of work that you would get done in academia. So they got passed over, and it was only fairly recently when a number of us started to write, and we kind of identified each other as scholars with an interest in Jehovah's Witnesses. And it was in 2016 that there was a conference organized in Antwerp that focused entirely on JWs. And work on Jehovah's Witnesses has accelerated since then, now that we've actually got a network and we've got an electronic list and exchange information about JWs. So the work is growing. There are other organizations that need to be caught up with by academics, Christadelphians being one of them. There is very little that's written about them.
So, concluding question, what should you say to a Jehovah's Witness?
Right. Well, yeah, the first thing I think I would say about that is don't be rude to them. They do get some abuse, although they do tell me that they enjoy their house-to-house work. If you're abusive to them, of course, you are just fulfilling biblical prophecy, because Jesus said that his followers would get abused by people, and they would get pilloried and be dragged before the law courts and so on. You're not going to talk them out of being Jehovah's Witnesses. If you try offering them any literature from your own religion, if you've got one, then they probably won't read it because they know that that's not the truth. But I think things to bear in mind are that they do leave, some of them leave the organization, and if they leave under a cloud, then they may well be lacking in friendship because of the policy of shunning. So to set yourself up as a potential friend might not be a bad thing. And I know that some who have left the society have found that beneficial. The last pair of Jehovah's Witnesses that called on me actually highlighted another advantage of being nice to them. And actually, I was just going out shopping at the time, and for various reasons, I hadn't parked my car directly outside. It was up the road in a little car park. So they left after about 20 minutes. We had a friendly conversation. And when I got my things and went out shopping, they were in the car park, and I spoke to them again. And they said to me, "We're very glad that you let us in and gave us a seat," because one of them had had a knee replacement operation, and the other had a problem with her hip and was going to a chiropractor's that afternoon. And she said, "We were just very glad to get in and have a seat." So they're human beings, same as us. It is an onerous task going round the doors, and there are these practical considerations that they have, and welcome the opportunity not only to talk to you about their faith, but just to have a little bit of comfort that's a respite in their house-to-house work. So be nice to them, I would say, and not attempt to convert them out of their faith, but just to listen. And I sometimes say things like it's good that you're creating an interest in religion in general, because there are so many people now that are just not interested at all in any form of religion.
Mhm. Well, on that wonderful, wonderful note, thank you very much, George Chryssides, for joining this program.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Likewise.